Carl, as your friend, I wanted to avoid some of the formalities of this conversation. The doctor spoke curtly, his normally stoic presentation now marred by visible tension in his shoulders and wrinkles on his brow as each word followed behind the closed exam room door. The diagnosis hit Carl like a brick, too stunned to really process what he was hearing. He felt as if the news suddenly materialized in his head, his sick, sick head. Tim, how? Carl spoke. I'm only 47. That's an old man's disease. It doesn't have rules. It's most commonly seen in people over 60, but 47 isn't impossible. But I'm only 47. Tim winced, hoping Carl's repetition stemmed from shock rather than the disease manifesting now. There's still more tests to run, but everything so far looks like it. The last few tests generally just confirm it, not deny it. Carl was silent. Carl, we can't predict it, but it tends to be more aggressive when it shows up early like this. I wanted to tell you before Marianne left. I know you said she was visiting her sister for a bit. Tim paused. I didn't want you to be alone with this information. They sat quietly for several moments. They had known each other since they were kids. Carl had been there for every milestone, and vice versa. But when Tim began his career in medicine, he hadn't thought of the weight of treating a loved one with such a horrible disease. It was easy, he thought, to treat a terminal stranger. But suddenly, looking at his friend, he felt like it was his first day in med school again, reading impossible Latin words in heavy, monotonous textbooks. The two parted as impromptly as the appointment had been scheduled. Carl sat in his car now, staring blankly at the road ahead through the stop-and-go traffic of road construction. Sometime earlier, days, weeks, he had scheduled an appointment to discuss his memory and mood, chalking their changes up to stress. His company, after all, was venturing into bold, new, and increasingly demanding but lucrative projects. 25 years slaving to that business just to end up shitting in a diaper before I'm even 50. He scoffed. The car behind Carl honked gently. He hadn't noticed that traffic moved without him, now feeling similarly about his life. The 20-minute ride into the city took over an hour in the present conditions, and an hour was far too long to consider his immediate options. Perhaps he wouldn't tell Marianne at all. Perhaps he could find a more dignified out before soiled briefs. No, he thought. Be it denial or resilience, he wasn't sure, but he wasn't willing to let his thoughts wander so darkly. He wouldn't tell Marianne just yet, he concluded. She would go on her trip, and he would have 2 weeks to determine a solution, or, if he was lucky, wake up from his nightmare. By the end of his commute, he had tricked himself into thinking none of it was real, but the facade didn't last. When he closed his eyes that night, he could only think of how many years he had spent under the guise that tomorrow was always promised. He was angry and confused, and his unrest only increased as he doubted the validity of those emotions. Were they simply his diagnosis? By nature, Carl was a stern man. He wasn't one to show emotions, and an ear-to-ear grin was considered boisterous by his peers. He was a mechanical, brilliant man of calculated reactions with thinning hair and a nondescript physique. It was typically easy for him to retreat into his fleeting mind, secretly hidden in his despair. And, thankfully, Marianne was too preoccupied with worry about last-minute essentials for her trip. She stressed about logistics and travel in general, and he, no difference than normal, opened and closed the doors for her, carried her suitcase to the counter at the airport queue, and kissed her lightly on the cheek goodbye. Upon returning home, Pixie, Marianne's half-deaf senior Yorkie, trotted eagerly to greet her, only to be sorely disappointed upon seeing Carl. Carl had never harmed the dog, but she was simply not fond of him, so the two merely coexisted. He frowned, yearning for any degree of comfort, but Pixie huffed in displeasure before returning to her prior activities. For the first time in a long time, Carl openly wept. That night, Carl's eyes squeezed shut with a grimace. Unrest and exhaustion whirled through his thoughts when he was suddenly annoyed and concerned by a noise unlike one that Pixie could conjure. A whisper, a slither. He was unsure. Was it his pulse rushing behind his swollen eyes? Where even was it coming from? He got up to investigate, his flat feet radiating the cold of the floor through his pale legs as the sound traveled further into the darkness of his home. He wasn't exactly afraid of what it could be. It just didn't sound like a good thing to hear. Thus, he briefly contemplated what he could use as a weapon. Even more briefly, he considered that this possible intruder could be his scapegoat, granting him the escape from the short future he refused to acknowledge. But, searching his expansive house, he could find nothing, and everything was silent once again. He paused to pour himself a glass of liquor in the darkness of the study. He stared indiscriminately at the bar countertop and examined the flecks in the granite while he sipped the amber fluid. Carl swirled the last of his drink in the ice and contemplated a second glass. He pushed his chair back to stand, but stopped to listen when the noise returned. It was raspy breathing now, and it had crept up directly behind him. "Don't look." The low, gravelly whisper interrupted him as he turned his body. "What do you want?" Carl questioned factually, abruptly stilling his body movement. "That depends what you want." "Quit playing games," Carl commanded, twisting the chair to stand and face the intruder. "Don't look." The whisper turned to a growl, and Carl felt a firm grasp on the back of his neck. The digits were cold and leathery and clicked at their joints. Carl was silent and still, replaying its inhuman pitch in his mind. "Close your eyes." He begrudgingly obeyed, and in response, the intruder wheezed softly for a moment before sliding something across the counter in front of Carl. Carl could smell its stale breath as it moved near him. "Look now." Carl eyed the hand mirror that had been placed before him and quickly held it up to scan behind him. "There," the voice interjected as the mirror revealed half of Carl's face. The rest of the mirror was filled with darkness. "Who are you?" "Look there. Don't you see me?" Before Carl could answer, he noticed 2 pinpoints of pale light, like distant stars, flickering and waning constantly. They were so faint they'd disappear if you looked right at them. Predatory beacons, staring back at Carl in the reflection. "What are you?" Carl stammered. "An option. An answer." Carl strained his eyes to see the face in the void, but in the shadows of his home, he could only see those cold, faded lights looking back. They blinked at him slowly and indifferently, now slightly brighter, and Carl thought about what it had just told him with such factual indifference. An answer, Carl thought, stiffening his body as he felt the thing move closer to him. There was a silence, but at long last it responded. "Yes." "How?" Carl spoke in half a whisper, knowing that things like this came with a cost, and purposely ignoring that his previous question had only been thought, never an audible statement. Although he could only see 2 specks of light, he could feel that it now smiled cruelly at him, a menacing grin full of needle teeth. The eyes stepped back so that they were simply concealed in the darkness. Carl could hear it shift in the shadows, and it whimpered, hissed, and grunted lightly. It was struggling with something out of sight. It sounded as if it were in pain. A wet, hollow sound. "Close your eyes," it commanded again. Cautiously, he did as he was told and felt his body tense as he listened to a wriggling noise. When Carl opened his eyes, he jumped. A chitin appendage twitched in front of him on the counter, sparkling like polished obsidian in its thick coat of translucent mucus. Carl flinched his eyes shut again, realizing that despite his denial, it was still there, writhing and bubbling. He forced his eyes open and found that the spine had melted, leaving only a familiar kitchen knife and a sizzling mess in its place.
The mirror.
Carl snatched the mirror, stealing a fleeting glimpse of several stilted legs and a multitude of shining eyes.
Blood.
It spoke, slowly, once again hidden by the shadows.
Gratitude is paid in blood.
The house practically glowed. Carl had ran through the house, turning on as many lights as possible as soon as the conversation with the thing in the void ended, and returned to his study. The last several weeks, everything was an ephemeral blur of emotions and doubt, and tonight exemplified such. The bottle of whiskey perched beside him. He had disregarded the effort of a glass, and he carefully examined the kitchen knife while the world spun behind the warmth of intoxication. Blood. It spoke so cryptically, but he was sure what it meant. It had also so graciously assured him that this time it didn't have to be anything grand, that it would accept a small offering. Did it, though? Or did that clarification just materialize in his mind? He didn't want to think of that. He shivered as he thought of the implication behind this time. It would want more, surely. Disturbed by Carl's antics to illuminate the house, Pixie trembled on her exaggerated arrangement of pillows and blankets in the corner of the study. She never spent much time in here. It was Carl's space, and she was practically glued to Marianne's hip. Carl set the knife onto the bar counter and peered out the wall of windows beside him. He reminisced about the day he brought Pixie home. They had always wanted kids. They fell pregnant easily, sure that the conception occurred on their honeymoon 26 years earlier. 7 months into the pregnancy, Marianne had been struck by a drunk driver, and the child was lost. Both of them were nearly lost, but a casualty of saving her life left her barren. They quietly grieved the baby for many years, and when that tragedy found as much peace as it possibly could in their hearts, they grieved the loss of future children too. But it was never mentioned again. 14 years later, Carl had thought that something small and warm would do Marianne well, and he couldn't have been more correct when he surprised her with a cardboard box with conspicuous holes on the sides. She fell in love with the pup immediately, and Pixie had so much love to reciprocate. It wasn't the awkward steps of a toddler to the house, but the scamper of little paws. It would do. She's 14, Carl thought, and I'm 47. I can make it up to Marianne. I can tell her it was an accident, and I can get her a new puppy. I'm only 47. Pixie, I can't leave Marianne. She suffered enough. But he paused, considering where reality fell only briefly. He turned to face her and stared silently. The dog quivered and cowed its head. I'm sorry, he stated flatly as he plucked the knife from the counter. Months came and went uneventfully. Marianne was understandably devastated by Pixie's death, but believed Carl unequivocally when he explained their demise. Conveniently, a coyote had been spotted in the neighborhood and killed a neighbor's cat. He did not question how such a perfect story coincided with his desperation, but he gladly accepted it and elaborated on it. Most surprisingly, as months approached a year, Carl's symptoms had not worsened. He started a medley of medications prescribed by Tim, and follow-up diagnostics revealed inexplicable improvement in brain atrophy. Tim couldn't explain it, leaning towards cautious optimism, but Carl could. As time progressed, without surprise from the visitor in the void, Carl began to believe and eventually argue for misdiagnosis. All the while, he kept it a secret. Carl's business ventures exploded. Not that the couple had any wants prior, but now their fortune was borderline ridiculous. A slew of interns, collaborators, and investors joined his success, and with them, the expected stressors followed. Marianne drew Carl a bath one evening, expecting him to return home, pinching the bridge of his nose as a growing migraine worsened. He smiled gently, grateful for her foresight, before departing to the solitude and warmth. He rolled his eyes at the mound of bubbles. Marianne insisted that the foam made it better, and certainly he didn't protest as he sunk his body chest deep into the hot, sudsy water. The humidity relaxed his lungs and fogged the mirror, and he closed his eyes, feeling the stress melt away with the subtle popping of soap bubbles. The scent of what he presumes to be lavender slowly muted in his senses. The gravelly whisper was barely audible, and he shot his eyes open at the first syllable.
It's been a while, Carl.
The haunting voice spoke. Immediately, Carl noticed the repeating pattern on the reflection of the bubbles.
You look well.
It spoke like an old friend, louder now than he acknowledged it, if even subtly. Carl didn't respond. Instead, he submerged his face to his nose in the floral froth, hoping that it would hide what he knew was present, but the reflection wouldn't change. It didn't seem possible, he thought. The reflection showed only the distorted visitor from the void. Not Carl, not the bath, not the room. He expected to see at least a part of himself in the bubble's reflection, or at least some semblance of the void's presence outside of the bubbles, and in person. Yet, there was nothing outside the fish-eyed, soapy images. He gawked across the tub, wiggling his blunt toes in the hot, viscous water, and he swore that he felt his limbs entangle with the visitor as if it were sitting plainly across from him. "I won't," Carl stated anxiously. Pop, 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 the repetitive sound of waning bubbles. Suddenly, a single black sphere emerged from the suds, its sharp tip smeared through its fragile foam cage effortlessly, and more legs followed suit until a monstrosity of limbs flailed in the tub, a combination of Carl's desperate exit strategy and many segmented, malicious joints. Carl fled the bathroom, wet and naked, and the monster wailed behind him. By now, several insect-like legs groped from the tub, glossy and black, reaching blindly for the foothold and target alike. As he opened the bathroom door, he ran into Marianne, knocking her to the ground. He pulled her aside from the unseen threat, all the while screaming. When she finally looked back at his invisible danger, there was nothing at all, not even the grand tower of lavender bubbles. Carl babbled incoherently at Marianne, forcing her to tears as he squeezed her shoulders in a vice and tried to drag her, force her, to haven. Overwhelmed and overpowered, she slapped him, crying harder as she felt his flesh quiver beneath her hand. She scuttled away from him and called emergency services. The arriving ambulance pulled into their looped driveway, with lights and sirens still going. TIA, the paramedic spoke sternly. It's basically a mini-stroke. A stroke? Marianne's eyes welled with tears again. It's transient, that's what the T means, the medic interjected. They're often harmless, but if it's his first, he needs follow-up. There could be a clot in his brain that hasn't fully lodged, or something else. I can't see that here. He gestured to the house as a whole. Marianne passed a glance at Carl as the paramedics urged him for consent to transport. Left to his own devices, he would have refused entirely, but his wife's discomfort and glower was far worse in the moment. He found some solace in the fact that the medic allowed him to walk to the ambulance, rather than be carried out via gurney. In the hospital, Carl was able to coordinate a message to Tim, who arrived as urgently as he could. Carl had expressed to the nurses to keep the information positive or simple as not to stress Marianne, lying that she had a weak heart and needed the news gradually at his decided pace, and, anticipating a second patient, they encouraged her to rest in a quiet, out-of-service room as midnight approached.
What do you mean you haven't told her?
Tom scolded Carl. I don't know what you want me to say. Carl brushed his remaining hair through his fingers out of stress.
Carl, this disease process.
Tim paused, stuck between professionalism and friendship.
You're dying, Carl. Nothing is normal or expected anymore.
Carl bit his tongue, sternly eyeing his friend.
Let me tell her, Tim. You have to.
Tim stepped from the room to breathe and collect his thoughts. Carl slumped against the pillows, slack-jawed and overwhelmed. He could hear that thing repeat in his mind.
You look well. Its horrific cries echoed. Hallucinations. It was a symptom, wasn't it? But they felt so real. Was he just sick? Was this all part of his clinical decline rather than the otherworldly nightmare he battled? Until he heard the nurses outside his room rant.
Randy's in room 19,
a homely nurse announced quietly to her younger peer.
Again, did the ambulance bring him? Yeah, this is his route. One of these days they'll find him stiff and dead on the streets. Where'd they find him this time? Outside the Bennies, like the last umpteenth time. He's definitely just too drunk. Can you get an IV started on him? Doc is going to want fluids and omeprazole. If you do that, I'll get Bay 3 prepped for the trauma patient that's en route.
Carl tuned out as the younger nurse agreed. He recalled how the creature in the void implied greater sacrifice when they first spoke, and Tim's advice overpowered the monster's voice for a moment. What was reality? Was he sick? Was he haunted? Was this all disease progression? If a dog bought me a year, he thought, surely Randy can provide longer. He scrunched his face at how quickly he came to that conclusion. Behavioral changes, he thought. Symptoms, he thought. The thoughts didn't last. Carl had ordered a rum and coke, requesting double soda to stretch the elixir without inebriation while he procrastinated his nefarious goal. He needed clarity and time at the dive bar, but just a pinch of liquid courage. Dive bar was a generous term for Benny's bar. He eyed the scarce regulars on the Tuesday night, 2 days after his escapade to the hospital, and scowled. He eventually stopped outside into an adjacent alley. Approaching the dumpster, he could see the slouched figure of a body, and with each closing step, he could hear the deep snores of the man. Carl stood in front of the slumbering drunk for some time, contemplating his next step. He kicked the man's foot, and, to his disdain, he startled awake. What you want? Randy slurred, stumbling for the empty plastic handle beside him. Carl flinched, horrified that the man could form any semblance of coherent sentences in his state. Randy was younger than Carl, but gaunt, fed thin on a liquid diet of booze and sorrow. With that in mind, Randy likely had some wild card of strength that the most desperate in society often possess. A last-ditch effort of survival. Randy, Carl spoke, confirming the vagrant's identity when the man acknowledged his name, but he couldn't find his next words. He needed Randy incapacitated. Do you? Carl stuttered. Do you want a party? Carl's face expressed disgust as he uttered the words. What you got? Randy beamed. Tim prescribed a small prescription of Xanax to Carl to help with the increasing anxiety of his diagnosis. Panic attacks weren't uncommon, and while he still maintained some semblance of frequent lucidity, a benzo was an appropriate means to still the fear at its worst. Fast-acting and popular on the streets, Carl thought. They were even the fruity-flavored dissolvable tablets. Carl hadn't touched them. Xanax, Carl frowned. Fuck yeah, Randy agreed, reaching toward Carl. The drug, coupled with his prior intoxication, left Randy as a barely conscious, grunting lump. Carl hadn't thought far enough ahead to consider the nearly dead weight of his heavily altered companion, but he was too close to let the added challenge stop him. He was able to rouse Randy to stand just enough to get him propped upright and supported. and escorted him to the car for the relatively quick drive home. And upon arrival, Carl dragged the homeless man into a wheelbarrow for the final transport distance. Carl wheeled his quarry to the back room. He shook Randy, who, by this point, remained incapable of walking, and returned to the front to check if Marianne had gone to sleep by now, as she normally did. Unsurprisingly, Marianne was awake, fretting Carl's well-being given recent events. Their conversation was curt and unfriendly, and Carl hoped that his rudeness would usher her to bed. He was correct, and he grimaced only briefly, finding his growing list of affronts to his life partner easier to complete. It was all crazy. He must be sick. No sane man snaps so readily like this, he thought. His panic subsided while he watched her scurry away with welled eyes, and his thoughts again returned to his ulterior task. Carl rolled the homeless man into his study. He expected immediate greeting from the thing in the darkness, but none came. He stood motionless. No sharpened carapace had been offered, and he dreaded grabbing the knife from the kitchen block. He stirred to action after a moment of doubt, knowing that eventually his prey would wake. Carl held the knife to Randy's throat, pausing to recall how much effort it took to cut through a thick chuck roast. His thoughts raced. Would the knife slice through the man's flesh, or would Randy wake with a bloody but survivable laceration across his neck from the blunt steel? Carl flipped the knife so that the edge faced himself now, and held the point firmly against the creases in Randy's neck, his hand grasping the handle of the knife like a lever. A bead of crimson began to form, and the knife bounced lightly with the pulse beneath it. In one swift motion, Carl plunged the knife through Randy's trachea, and then pulled it up and forward, ripping his windpipe and jugular in a jerky motion against the dull blade. Randy, drugged beyond response, gurgled on his blood, choking and drowning as he bled out, yet never waking as the wheelbarrow filled with crimson. His body twitched lightly as he died, until he was fully still, and his lean muscles collectively and exaggeratedly relaxed. Randy's head lolled backwards, stopping only against the support of the wheelbarrow, and exposed the organic piping that Carl had torn apart to end the man's life.
You gave me such a cherished memory last time.
The thing in the reflection spoke suddenly with disappointment. Carl hadn't noticed it arrive, lurking in the distorted image of the black windows.
This is more, and this is better,
Carl defended. He was silent, but fuming. He had given the thing a dog the first time. Now he provided an entire man, and it wasn't pleased.
You wanted blood. Look at it all.
Carl yelled as he reached his hands in the warm pool of blood that had formed in the wheelbarrow.
I've brought you blood. Now give me my mind.
More, it whispered.
More,
Carl repeated, dumbstruck, and watched the pale pinpoints of light slowly blink away to darkness. Carl ignored the creature's demands over the next few weeks, and gradually his symptoms worsened. He forgot the meaning of words and struggled to use familiar objects. At times he couldn't even recognize himself, and at worse times he didn't fully recognize Marianne. Marianne, growing increasingly concerned by the now obvious changes she saw in her mate, felt emboldened reaching out to Tim. Tim sighed on the other line, dreading the pending paperwork that could sign away his dear friend's medical autonomy. He worried that Carl had slipped too far into the disease to make his own decisions, but planned to meet with Carl before he fully considered that possibility. And all the while, Carl argued with himself and suffered aggressive outbursts. Steam filled the bathroom. Carl hadn't taken a bath since the incident in the tub and avoided showering as well. But despite his wariness, he more frequently saw concerning reflections wherever things shined back, and no longer just in the soap bubbles. Eventually, he submitted to a shower. The water rolled off his back while Carl rehearsed and failed a memory challenge he had been practicing. Something to keep his mind sharp, he thought. A simple poem, but he couldn't recreate it, and he grew increasingly frustrated. Stepping from the shower with a towel around his waist, he placed his hands on the sink vanity and stared at his distorted reflection through mirrored fog.
Memories.
The voice was as deep and as inhuman as always.
Fleeting wisps of smoke in the flailing mind. Can you not remember them, Carl?
It asked, approaching Carl so that a black shape loomed behind him. Carl wiped the moisture from a portion of the mirror, revealing a piece of the monster's image for the first time in crystal clarity in the sliver of swiped reflection.
You were reciting your wedding vows, Carl. You swore you'd never forget them. Can't you remember?
Why are you doing this? Carl wept.
Me doing this?
The thing feigned shock and offense at the accusation.
Carl, I will love you forever, through triumph and tragedy.
Carl could feel the monster's smirk through the fog. It chuckled lightly and wheezed while a tear streamed down Carl's face.
Ever since I first laid eyes on you in 9th grade.
Stop it!
I have loved you always and will love you forever. Forever, Carl. That's a long time. A big promise. Are you so sure now? Now that some days you can't even recognize her. Carl, can you keep the promise of forever? Carl, what is your daughter's name? The dead one.
Leave me be, please. Carl pleaded.
Jennifer, what? Oh, what a pity. She's only a memory now. Oh, no, you've forgotten her too, didn't you?
The thing went silent.
You know what I want.
Carl watched it step further into the fog until it was no longer visible, and he thought what he could offer it now to stop the disease. Carl thought of his business when the fragmented memories of his overly eager interns returned. At least a few of them were too flirty with the boss, and possibly too willing to do anything for the perception of power. Savannah, Carl thought. His stomach churned at how unfair life was that he couldn't remember the vows he swore to his wife or his daughter's name, but could remember the name of the bimbo that worked for him. On the 12th floor, overlooking the heart of the moderate city, now orange with dusk and erupting incandescent bulbs, Carl stopped Savannah as she finished the last of her paperwork. He had strategically given her extra tasks today, knowing that would slow her departure and isolate her from her colleagues. And throughout the day he hinted, enticing her flirtatious nature, and she reciprocated. Carl had spent prior time reviewing his recent prescriptions. Zolpidem, Xanax, and Benadryl, for good measure. He took the pills and ground them into a fine powder, and finally placed the sedatives in the bottom of a glass. He staged it as it had been, careful to pose it out of sight. With only the foreign janitor wandering the hall, he invited Savannah into his office. Hours earlier, she had undone the top button of her blouse, so that a wisp of lace teased from her cleavage. She postured to emphasize her breasts now. Walking toward him, he placed a hand on her lower back and calmly ushered her inside his office, complimenting her work ethic and beauty. Caught up in the prime of her life and the competition of her peers, she could suddenly see how this was such an easy route. She was surprised that Carl had made a move. She was sure he wasn't that kind of boss. A flicker of guilt crossed her mind before the allure of opportunity replaced it. The crystal glass chimed as he casually dropped a few ice cubes into each, and a shot of his finer liquor followed. He stirred his first, then hers, carefully mixing his concoction, and handed her the dubious cocktail. Savannah had only noticed that he poured from the expensive bottle and thought to herself that she wouldn't pass an opportunity tonight to elevate her career. Carl felt foreign to himself and hesitated, staring blankly at the empty window. He could hear the visitor whispering in his mind.
Blood.
It chanted. Savannah approached and turned him to face her. Afraid he was getting cold feet, she had to act swiftly. She hadn't suspected the conflict of a broken mind in front of her. Tracing a finger down his chest to his waist, she grabbed his crotch and smirked. He had always been fiercely loyal to Marianne, but in this moment he could not recall the warmth of her body nor the memory of her name. So when Savannah pawed at his belt and trousers, he didn't protest and hoisted her onto the office table, scattering pens and papers. He hiked her dress up, and she wrapped her legs around him, and together they enacted their carnal act. For a moment, he forgot his diagnosis and his dismay, and for a moment, she felt the delirious and blissful blur of the medications that Carl had used to drug her. After they finished, Carl poured himself another drink while she sat, spread eagle on the table, and struggled to remain awake. She incoherently slurred threats of a permanent position. Behind her, where light did not interject across the glass pane, the visitor from the void observed with stillness. Carl was indifferent. Savannah collapsed onto the table, panties still clinging to her foot, and Carl stepped forward with his kitchen knife. As the blade flashed in the office light, it cut the reflection of the void. "How was he doing?" Tim asked, embracing Marianne. "He has good days and bad days," she stated, exhaustion heavy on her normally melodic voice. "Today is a bad day." Tim nodded sympathetically. "He's been going on about the man with the knife more often. Sometimes he calls it a spider. We put new curtains up to try to keep him from obsessing, and the nurse still has some luck redirecting him. But almost every night she finds him tugging at the curtains, terrified. He gets worse about this time in the evening." "Is he lucid?" "That's a generous term. I guess he's as lucid as he could be. He eats less. He needs more help with everything. Each day, he seems less like himself." She was quiet before tears formed at the creases of her eyes. "The things he says, I know they're delusions, but half the time, he doesn't even know who I am. And he can be so cruel." She wiped the tears and then laughed half-heartedly. "But he told me that you're Frank Sinatra and he's your business partner." Tim placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Get some rest, Marianne. The nurse is here, and I'll visit him for a while." She nodded gratefully. Tim somberly walked down the hallway, rehearsing the strategies they had developed to de-escalate Carl when he was at his worst. Marianne had remodeled a large, accessible room into a makeshift hospice space. She had placed standing blinds around his bed to try to limit wandering tendencies at night. And beside his bed were the large windows he so greatly obsessed over. As Tim entered the room, he could see the floor-length curtains shake, their full view concealed by the standing curtains. "Well, I guess he'll be fixated on the knife man tonight." Tim sighed, dreading the inevitable panic and outbursts as he tried to redirect and calm him. But as Tim stepped around the standing blinds, he found Carl propped in bed and tucked tightly under the covers. The curtains suddenly stilled. Emotionless and fully aware, Carl looked at Tim. "You see it now, too, don't you?"
Thank you for listening and delving with me into the dark together.
Please remember to leave a thumbs up and subscribe if you feel so inclined.
The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others.
Thus, the following will grow.
All stories read in this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, and just about everywhere else. Links in the description.
Thank you for listening and feeding the cause. We'll be seeing you